You were cheated out of $381 billion, says David Sirota, and that was just last year. It goes on year after year after year. Check this out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I'm proud to say that I'm a subscriber to the newsletter that my old colleague and friend David Sirota produces, TMI. He's a journalist. He's the editor-at-large at Jacobin Magazine. He's the author of 3 books, the former senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. DavidSirota.com is his website where you can find out about his newsletter. And you can tweet him, of course, at David Sirota. David, welcome back to the program. Great to have you with us. You've been writing about how the 1% are cheating us out of $250 billion in taxes every year. Riff on this.
Yeah, there's a new government report that came out from the Congressional Budget Office, which found that between 2011 and 2013, $381 billion of taxes went unpaid every single year. Now, if you combine that finding, which just came out at the end of last week, with a recent Harvard University study that showed the top 1% are responsible for about 70% of that tax gap, you get the full picture. That every single year, the top 1% are not paying about $250 billion of taxes that they owe, but that go, again, unpaid. So we're not talking about, higher or lower taxes, which tax rates. We're talking about just the taxes that are owed. $250 billion a year is not being paid, taxes that are owed to the U.S. government by the top 1%. And if you start thinking about what that $250 billion could pay for, it starts to get, kind of mind-boggling here. I mean, $250 billion, Bernie Sanders, who requested that Congressional Budget Office study, put it this way. He said, with the money that these tax cheats owe this year alone, we could fund tuition-free college for all, eliminate child hunger, ensure clean drinking water for every American household, build 500,000 affordable housing units, provide masks to everybody, produce the protective and medical supplies our healthcare workers need to combat the pandemic, and fully fund the U.S. Postal Service. That's just with the money, again, that the top 1% owes but doesn't pay in taxes every single year.
I recall during the Reagan administration and the first Bush administration, there was a lot of talk about the evil IRS and all this kind of stuff. But correct me if I'm wrong, my recollection is that it was really during the George W. Bush administration that they aggressively started the defunding of the Internal Revenue Service. And that in the first weeks of the Trump administration, or maybe the first months, they announced that they were offering early retirement to as many as I recall, the number that's in my head, and again, this is from memory, David, my apologies, but is that they offered 15,000 out of 57,000 workers. Now, I might be mixing this up with Social Security Administration, early retirement. So basically, what's happened is that the IRS is down. This is classic starve the beast. Reagan's, David Stockman's strategy. The IRS is down to the point where they almost can't do anything about this. In fact, they're more frequently auditing the returns of people who have an earned income tax credit. In other words, the government gives them money because their income is so low. People are making under $20,000 a year. They're more frequently auditing those returns than they are the returns of very wealthy people. And I realize there's fewer wealthy people, but you know what I'm talking about. I'm not saying necessarily in absolute numbers. As a percentage, you're more likely to be audited if you're poor, basically.
And that is a reflection of the budget situation that you outlined. There have been massive budget cuts to the IRS. That's absolutely true over the last about 10 years. And it costs more per audit to audit the super rich and ultimately process a civil or a criminal case against the super rich than it does to audit the poor, because the super rich are using complex tax schemes and have armies of lawyers. I should mention corporations as well, auditing corporations. So you have a situation where massive budget cuts have driven down the audit rates of corporations and the wealthy to the point where poor people are being audited as frequently or even more frequently as the super rich, even though most of the money in unpaid taxes in aggregate is coming from or would be owed by the top 1%. And here's a stat about what's gone on in the Trump administration, which we reported on at TMI, which is that over the last 5 years, the Trump Justice Department has been prosecuting far fewer criminal cases referred by the IRS. So those are potentially should be prosecuted, referred to the DOJ, 66% fewer criminal prosecutions off of IRS referrals in the last 5 years under Trump.
It's mind-boggling. And then you add to that the fact that for every dollar spent on enforcement by the Internal Revenue Service, multiples, and I don't have that number in front of me, perhaps you do, but for every dollar we spend, we get a hell of a lot more than $1 back. And yet the Republicans and some Democrats have, for the better part of 40 years, been cutting the budget of the IRS.
Yes, I mean, in the CBO report, I don't have the numbers exactly in front of me, but what they basically say is tax enforcement is one of those things where if you spend money, you actually gain more money back. In other words, spending on rebuilding the IRS's enforcement budget actually isn't just deficit neutral. It actually increases revenue to the federal government because you're ending up being able to collect the taxes that are actually owed. Now, look, Trump has put forward most recently a budget that puts a little bit more money into enforcement. But the experts basically say that this needs to be a multi-year rebuilding of this agency. And again, the costs are just enormous. I mean, $250 billion a year, I mean, that is astronomical amounts of money that are effectively being stolen by the super rich, every single year. I mean, that's the other part. $250 billion every single year. That is not small change. That is a huge amount of money.
Right. It's mind-boggling. Are there any efforts to do anything about this anywhere in our government, David Sirota?
Well, I mean, look, there have been some progressives who have been pushing for a higher spending on enforcement. That was what the whole CBO study was about, which is that if you put money into enforcement, you will gain more revenue back. But again, you're going to have an army of corporate lobbyists and those kinds of folks who don't really want the IRS to
aren't Republicans really saying in fighting any effort to expand or to rebuild the IRS? I mean, let's be clear, it's been torn apart. Aren't the Republicans saying, by opposing any efforts to put the IRS back into place, that they are just nakedly, openly, right up front, proud, waving the flag of we are the politicians who are the pets of, the wholly owned subsidiaries of, the toadies of the billionaire class, period, full stop, and to hell with everybody else in America?
Well, what they basically set up is a self-reinforcing ideology that doesn't make them admit essentially what you just said. What they basically said is, for the last 10 years, a lot of the rhetoric was the IRS, as you suggested, is sort of this overzealous, monstrous agency, and therefore we need to pare it back. We need to limit the IRS, and that justified the budget cuts. Now, fast forward to today, and what you often hear from the Republicans is, oh, well, look, we can't afford it. Maybe we've cut too far. Maybe the budgets of these agencies has been cut too much. But you know what? Now we've got a big deficit, so now we can't afford it. That assumes, of course, that the public won't understand that, again, investing in the IRS is one of those investments where you end up gaining more revenue. But the Republicans have created a kind of circular logic that says that they can use the deficit to justify continued cutting.